Hello, everyone. Pastor George here, and welcome to this episode of A New Thing. Do you ever have a book that is a comfy read for you? Because I do. Like every few years, I'll revisit it, and I just love it every time. And I don't know if that's because it's particularly well written, which I think it is. Or if it's like nostalgic for me because I read it at like a younger time in my life, or because it's been so impactful in my own kind of writing or genres that I like to read or things like that. But I have a comfy book, and the comfy book for me is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you haven't read this book, it's absolute, I think, at least a once in your lifetime read. You really should. Especially if you're a Christian, as we're going to see today. I think the themes of this book tackle a very serious issue in our culture and really all cultures of all time. I think this is a universal thing, and the way it does it is I think so beautiful, and kind of the summation of the argument. And obviously, there's going to be spoilers today, but I'm just going to say like the hope of this book is that it's a journey, not a destination. I mean, it's called. I think the full kind of idea of it is called The Hobbit, but it kind of has a subtitle which is There and Back Again. And so, while what I'm going to read is not the complete end of the book, it is a major thing that happens. And so, I just want to be upfront. If you're like someone who's really sensitive to that, go read the book. Come back to this. This is a great summer read, but I'm hoping that even if you watch this, you'll want to read it because hopefully the prose that I'll read will show you how approachable the book is, and also how great the themes are in it, especially when we line them up with the Bible, which shouldn't surprise us, right? I did a movie series last summer, and we looked at the Lord of the Rings movies, which are based on the books by J.R.R. Tolkien, and J.R.R. Tolkien is a Christian, specifically Catholic writer, and so like Christian themes and all that stuff pop up over that series all over the place, especially in the general thrust of the story and the universe and the problems that are going on in it. Not at all like C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia. Not super unlike it either, but more difference, I would say, than similar. So it's not as straightforward as the Chronicles of Narnia and kind of the story that it's telling. But in that, I think it actually mirrors the lived reality of the world that we experience a lot better. Even though there's like elves and dwarves and all sorts of weird stuff. Just the themes of what the story is talking about are so important. You can, if you wish, if you're not a book person, you can watch the Hobbit movies. I am not a huge fan of them. They made 3 of them. And if you read the book, you're going to be astonished that they made 3, because unlike the Lord of the Rings series, which is 3 books for 3 movies, The Hobbit is 1 book. And it's not a particularly long one either. I think most copies run, 200, 250 pages. So it's not particularly a challenging read. I'm not entirely sure if it's Genesis, but I heard that it was originally kind of written by Tolkien for his children as kind of like a bedtime story, and then he expanded it out to a novel, and it was published. It actually predates, it was published before The Lord of the Rings, even though he wrote The Lord of the Rings first. Basically, from my understanding, is he wrote The Lord of the Rings and then tried to get it sold, and no one wanted it, which I can understand, having read those books, and not being their biggest fan. But then he made this, and everyone loved it, and that basically opened the doors for getting his other work published. And so this is much more approachable, I think, and definitely worth reading. And you don't need to know all the lore and background. It's just a fun adventure story, perfect for middle school kids, I think, maybe late elementary as well. So, and that's because that's when I read it. But I want to tie this in so that the thrust of the story is that they are going to the Bilbo, and if you know the Lord of the Rings, the little guys, the hobbits, right? The main one's name is Frodo. This is his uncle. So Bilbo is recruited by Gandalf the Wizard and this group of dwarves to go to this place called the Lonely Mountain, where the dwarves, a few decades or centuries, whatever you want to say before, have been kicked out by a dragon named Smaug. And he's taken all their gold. And so they want to go back and they want to get their gold. And that's kind of the whole thrust of the story, right? Very simple. And they, have adventures along the way. All right? It's great. But that theme of gold really just carries throughout the novel. And I'm sure, you've heard this before, especially if you're a Christian. In our popular culture, people will say the money is the root of all evil. I'm sure you've heard, if you've been in this space long enough, been a Christian long enough, you've definitely heard that that's not actually what the Bible says, right? It's from 1 Timothy, and it says, for the love of money is the root of all evil, right? And that, of course, complicates the picture. But what does that mean, to the love of money? And this is something that I think that the New Testament, specifically Jesus, is very concerned by. And he should be. He knows our hearts, right? He knows how we feel about money. And what money provides for us, which is security and power. It's a very tangible way of seeing those things. And so I just want to look at two stories from the Gospel of Matthew, and then a very famous part for me. Maybe it's not very famous, but for me, it's the part of the Hobbit that's always stuck out to me the most. So the first Bible section I want to read is this Matthew 6:19. And Jesus is speaking here, right? He says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And he said, and that's a famous kind of line, right? That where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So what does that mean? Right? What does that mean? We're going to get to it. We're going to use the Hobbit to kind of help us to understand what I think Jesus is getting at there. But I just want to look at another quick story, and then we're going to return to this one. This is the story of the rich young man. I'm sure you're familiar with this one as well, if you've kind of been blessed with the chance to be well read in the Bible, but it's a good one. So this is later in the Gospel of Matthew. It says, and behold, a man came up to him saying, Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life? And he said to him, why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. If you would enter life, keep the commandments. He said to him, which ones? And Jesus said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus quotes a lot just to say from the Ten Commandments here, and then when it says, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is also one of the commandments given in the law in the Old Testament, but not part of the Ten Commandments. So he does, and this is a very common thing, you would take two different sources and put them together. You see the Gospels do this, you see lots of people do this, rabbis do this, it's normal. The young man said to him, all of these I have kept. What do I still lack? Which is interesting, right? Even you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Most of us, I think, would that be impossible to keep. But this young man claims that he has. As Jesus said to him, if you would be perfect, maybe so maybe Jesus doesn't, maybe he sees through. This man thinks he has, but maybe Jesus sees through it. He says, go and sell what you possess and give it to the poor, and you will have treasures in heaven, and come, follow me. When the young man heard this, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. So you can see between these two stories, what is the idea, right? Well, where is your heart? Where is your heart? Right? So we're going to read this section of The Hobbit again. Spoilers, although I think it's great. And you should read it anyway. Maybe reading the story will make you appreciate this section even more. But there's a time at the end of the book where there's battles, right? There's a battle that happens, and the leader of the dwarves, this guy named Thorin, is mortally wounded. And this battle is fought for the treasure that they have. And And this whole time, Thorin has been kind of the epitome of what we would worry about, what Jesus warns of us here, right? Where your treasure is, there your heart is also. That is what Thorin's heart is. He wants his treasure. He wants to reclaim what was lost. That's what he cares about. And the things that he does impact relationships that he has and ultimately, drive a wedge. But there is a restoration that happens, and it comes when he dies. And he is there with Bilbo, the main character, who has kind of come to comfort him as he's dying, and he doesn't want Thorin to die, of course. So I'm going to read this section. I got this off a website. This is from the book. You'll see the emphasis is added by the author because he's upset how the movie changed the scene. But that's by the by. I think the movie does a fairly decent job with this. I'm not as upset as some people, but this is what Thorin says. Farewell, good thief. I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all gold and silver and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship from you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate. He had said some mean things to him in the past. Bilbo knelt on one knee, filled with sorrow. Farewell, king under the mountain, he said. This is a bitter adventure if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad that I have shared in your perils. That has been more than any Baggins deserves. No, said Thorin. There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell. And then he dies, right? I get chills every time I read that. That's such an amazing passage of this book. And you can see right there, right? And I'm glad that this person added the emphasis so I can point you to part of this that really, really drives this home, right? If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. And this is right in line with what Jesus is teaching here. Now, and the reason it is because this is about what do we desire, right? What is the highest good that we can think of? And for Thorin, it was going back, getting his gold, and that causes all sorts of kind of sadness in his death at the end. But for the hobbits, specifically Bilbo, right, what they value is food, cheer, and song. They enjoy kind of the simpler things, not the hoarding of wealth. And that is in the sense of what Jesus is getting at. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Right? What do you desire or value most? Now, Tolkien is not saying, I think, that these things are the highest good all the time. But he's pointing out that just these small things, relatively, kind of normal things, small things that we experience in everyday life are of more value than a lot of money. And I think that this is the ultimate thrust of a lot of what the Bible has to teach us in the New Testament about money, right? Is like, what is of more value? Is it money, or is it following God? And that's the thrust, right? That's the heart aspect. The heart has to deal with desire, right? That's the whole thing. Oftentimes we're told a lot of times in our culture, follow your heart. Not great biblical advice, I will say. The heart often can deceive itself or can be deceived by other things. Our desires, we can often be led to desire things that we should not. Sometimes we might have good reasons for that. Sometimes we might not. And that's where the difficulty is. So finding what your treasure is and what you care about most tells you where your heart is going to be. So for Thorin, that treasure up until his deathbed was the gold that belonged to his people that he wanted to reclaim and not give to anyone else. And you see now that at the end of his life, when he's going to die, and he realizes that it's not coming with him, what's actually really important. And of course, it is often when we have gone through great difficulty, that is when we actually realize what's important and what's not. And so Jesus here calls us to turn our hearts towards him, to figure out where is our treasure. And the Greek word for that is thesaurus, in case you didn't know. Where is your thesaurus? Where is your treasure? And go follow that thing. And Jesus is saying that's God. God is the ultimate treasure. That is where your heart should be. You know, money is not by itself an evil thing, and many of these other things aren't evil things. But treasure is what the treasure that you care about. The most important one is God. And that's where you can see kind of in a dual reading between the Bible and the Hobbit what to think or how to view in a very practical way the love of money, right? What does that actually mean? You know, what does it mean to love money? Because I think many people who don't think what they're doing is loving money, right? But where are they getting their ultimate sense of security and purpose from is their money. And it's not to be found there, right? It's ultimately to be found in God. And so as I was reading The Hobbit again this year, that really stuck out to me as just being such an important thing to remember. And so I want to send you guys out today with that. Just remember to make God the treasure of your heart. Go read The Hobbit if you haven't. It's a wonderful book. And I will see you on Sunday for worship. Have a wonderful rest of the Thursday. Hopefully the weather gets a little bit nicer today. And peace out.